Thank you, Professor Rahman. What a pleasure it is to be here at your invitation in this wonderful institution. And as we were walking up, I was remarking to your Pro Vice Chancellor that this is what this game is all about, right? We see the energy of the young people, and every year there is a new crop, as in agriculture, right? We grow older, but the students who come in stay the same, right? That is what is so energizing, and it's good to see so many young people as well in the audience. And the talk that I'm about to give you is personal for many reasons, and I will also share a reason why this links up to Bangladesh in a minute. But first, the story about how this came to be. I'm an economist. I study organizations. My thesis 32 years ago was on incentive and control issues in organizations, and I've been an academic ever since. But when we returned to India, the one thing that was a puzzle in my mind was, why are these American universities so good? You know, I was there in the United States for more than 20 years as a PhD student, as a professor, as lots of other things along the way, along with my academic career. But the one thing that really puzzled me was, why were these universities so good? I had seen them from the inside, of course, and I came as a representative of another fine American university to India, to another great institution in India, and I was very fortunate to do that. But somehow that I could never understand why we couldn't replicate that success in India, or for that matter, anybody could. Nobody has really done it outside of the United States. Maybe one or two universities in England, perhaps. The Germans have not been able to do it. The French have not been able to do it. The Italians, the Spaniards, nobody has a university comparable to, say, the top 20 universities in the United States. If you leave aside a couple of 2 or 3 universities in England, nobody has been able to crack the code. So I said maybe it has to do, and my hunch was that it had to do with their governance. So now this is interesting. This is before everything was on the web. So sitting in India, sitting in Ahmedabad, I literally called up the president's offices of the top 100 universities in the US. Some information I was able to get online, and I said, tell me your board composition. I want to know who sits on your board. Because my hunch was that it has to do with how they are governed, right? Because governance is really the highest level association with the university, right? And that is where everything is set. Your culture, your values, your management system, your accountability, your resource allocation, everything is set from there. And what I found, it took me about a year to get that information. One university refused flatly, so I had information on 99. One of them was very suspicious. They said, why are you looking for this? This was Brigham Young University, Mormons, run by Mormons. And they're very wonderful people, but they're somewhat secretive about things. So anyway, I said, this is why I'm looking for it. They gave me that information. And then when I tallied it, I found something stunning, and I'll share that information 10 years later. I mean, I have the more up-to-date information also, that whether they are public or private, religious or non-religious, they are run by alumni. And I'll tell you why that is such a significant thing in a minute. So then I wrote this paper, and I was asked to present this first in Singapore at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, sorry. And from there, I got an invitation to present it in France. So I get up there. It's a very distinguished panel. I'm the least distinguished person on that panel. But I get up nonetheless, and I ask a question. And I said, look, it's very ironic that an Indian is getting up in France to talk about American universities, but tell me who invented the university. And nobody knew. Now, this is amongst the most distinguished audiences you can find anywhere, the top academics from France, judges of the International Court of Justice, CEOs, ministers, etc., all were there, and nobody knew the answer. And then one lady got up, she's now a very good friend, and she uttered 4 words that went like a bullet through my heart. She said, the Greeks, of course. That who else could invent it except the Greeks, right? So I said, no, ma'am, that is not true. They were invented in our part of the world, and we had the best universities in the world for over 1,000 years. And I mentioned Nalanda and Takshala, which I'm sure some of you have heard about, and I left it at that. That was my extent of my knowledge at that time. So I decided to tell that story, and I thought it would take 1 year maybe to gather all the material. Well, today it's the 10th year. In July, I'll complete 10 years. That conference was in July of 2012. And only now do I believe that I have finally been able to pull together most of the things that I need. Because the material was in so many different primary languages and secondary languages. And I had to answer so many questions along the way that nobody had asked, which tells you that we have not told our story. And when I say our story, it is the story that we share in common, that India and Bangladesh and Pakistan and Sri Lanka share in common, because these innovations happened here. So this talk is not about those innovations. I'm happy to address those in our Q&A, because I could spend literally 7 days talking non-stop about what I have found. And I'll share some of that with you, and also a subsidiary reason for my coming to Bangladesh. So I decided to tell that story, and you'll see both my original question and my subsequent answers here in the talk. All right. So now, what is so special about universities? Now, the most interesting thing about universities is that they are the longest lived institutions created by man. Longest lived. So look at this quotation by Clark Kerr, who was the founder of the wonderful system known as the University of California system, 10 universities, right? He laid the foundations of those great universities. And he said of the 85 institutions that still exist from 1520, so literally he said this about 40 years ago, but right now exactly 500 years have passed. And he said of these 85 institutions, 70 are universities. Think about it. So by the way, this is what I tell the founders of private universities in India. You know, they're all from the corporate sector. They built great companies. I said, your company may or may not be around in 30 years' time. If you look at the S&P 500, from 50 years ago, 90% of the companies are gone, merged, dissolved, bankrupt, whatever. Only 10% remain after 50 years. And these institutions remain after hundreds of years, right? So I said, if you really want to leave something behind that the world will remember you by for millennia, build a great university. Build a great university. And you know, ULAB is an experiment along those dimensions. So I'd like to share with you, how do you take ULAB, or any university for that matter, to world-class status, right? World-class, and how do you do it? All right. So first of all, you have to understand the reason why it is the longest lived institution is because it is also the most complex institution ever invented by man. And I say that because every form, I mean, any economists here in the audience? Anybody with a degree in economics? Okay, one, okay, two, maybe some are three, some other four, okay, good. So it is a classic example of every form of market failure that you can imagine. Every form of market failure. Now, why is that the case? This was understood way back in India. There is the great epic, I'm sure some of you have heard about it, the Mahabharata. It says very clearly that in education, 4 things are important. The student, the effort by the student, the teacher, the fellow students, and time. Now this market failure is embedded, because think about it as follows. If you are going to a great institution, you learn as much from the great students who are your fellow students there as you do by your own efforts, and from the great professors. And therefore you can see immediately why the market mechanism fails, because if this were a for-profit entity driven by profit maximization, what I call market forces, then you would want to admit people in great institutions on the ability to pay, right? A Stanford or a Yale would basically say, I'll sell my seat for $1 million, and there'll be enough takers from around the world. But that is precisely what they do not want to do, because the moment they do that, they'll kill the university. Because then, it's like Groucho Marx basically saying, I don't want to belong to a club that will admit me. So it's literally like that. You want the very best students and the very best faculty to come together, and that cannot happen because of market forces. Because if you were to admit students on the basis of their ability to pay, as opposed to their ability to learn, which has nothing to do with their ability to pay, you're going to kill the university. So that is market failure number one. Market failure number two is that you produce knowledge. All this fine knowledge that is here, some produced by ULAB folks, is a gift to the world. I'm going to take some of it home with me when I return to India. And it's a public good. Public goods have to be financed publicly. They cannot be financed privately. If you do, you will provide too little of it. And similarly, I won't go into the details, screening and externalities are critical. I mean, externalities meaning if you're educated, you benefit me. If I'm educated, I benefit you. And therefore, you cannot capture the full benefit privately. So that is another point. So as a result, universities are subject to all kinds of market failure. And as a result, it took a long time in human history for the first university to come about. And that was Takshila, which is now in Pakistan. And the second one was Nalanda. And subsequently, some universities in Bangladesh as well, of which Sompura and Jagaddal are two examples that I'll just touch upon. So basically, this is why universities are so difficult to build and operate and govern. Because it's not clear what will work. And it has been a 2,600-year process over which there are 24 innovations that I'll just quickly run through. I won't go into the details. That will be important. Okay. By the way, this even Socrates, this is from Plato's dialogue Protagoras. He's also aware of one of those, the asymmetric information part. He says before you buy something to eat, you can actually open the container and see what it is like. You can smell it. But before getting an education, you can't really smell it, right? So it may be too late by the time the damage is done. So this is all, so this is known. The Mahabharata knew it, Socrates knew it. Now this is the other thing, when I basically started researching this is the other dagger that went through my heart, which is the statement by Walter Reig. So this is a 3-volume study by 20 of the finest academics who are working in this area. And this is the opening statement from this history of the university in Europe. They argue the university is a European institution. A community of teachers and taught accorded certain rights such as administrative autonomy and the determination and realization of curricula, courses of study and the objectives of research, as well as the award of publicly recognized degrees, which is a creation of medieval Europe, which was the Europe of papal Christianity. So this is what they claim. The book that I'm working on will show that every one of these assertions is wrong. Every one of these things happened in this part of the world. And what I've done is that I've compiled the evidence, archaeological evidence, textual evidence, all primary evidence to show that every one of these innovations was present. In fact, most of them were present also in Sompura, which I'll talk about right here in Bangladesh, much before the Europeans even began to think about it. And now, the most hair-raising experience that I had, so the beauty of this is that for the past 10 years, literally every single day I have found something new that causes me to jump up and down with joy. I have put everything aside. I've not written very much in the meantime, a couple of edited books here and there, but lightweight stuff. All my intellectual energies are in building organizations, my day job, and my night and weekend job is this work. And I must share with you the most interesting link which I was waiting for. I could not find, I thought that these were parallel institutions that were developed first in this part of the world and then in Europe. And what I found is that they solved the same problems in almost the same order, of course separated by 1,000 years. And I couldn't find a link until I gave a talk about a month ago at the Jaipur Literature Festival. And William Dalrymple, some of you are familiar with him and his work, he pointed a book out to me called The Warriors of the Cloisters, written by a professor at Indiana University. And it's a book that only he could have written. Why? Because it required expertise in Tibetan, Sanskrit, Arabic, and Chinese. Very few people, certainly nobody in India has that expertise. I doubt if anybody in Bangladesh has it. And you needed all of that together to basically, and what he showed, something is very interesting. He said that the hardware and the software of the university, that is the physical layout, as well as the method of argumentation, which later was called the scholastic method in Europe, was borrowed from this part of the world, from Central Asia, because as you know, Central Asia went from, and like Bangladesh was Buddhist, before it became Muslim, right? Most part of it, and Hindu. It was Hindu and Buddhist, mostly Buddhist before it became Muslim. So was Central Asia. And in Central Asia, there's a place called Ajina Tepe, which is in currently Tajikistan, where all these stans meet. And Ajina Tepe was a Buddhist monastery, which then became Muslim. And the whole design was taken into what then became the madrasa. Madrasa not as a primary school, but as an institution of higher learning, not one that is associated with obscurantism today, but one that was associated with the frontiers of knowledge. So what Beckwith argues is that the madrasa was the reason why Islamic civilization took the knowledge from the Greeks and India and took this hardware and software which was developed here of the layout of the university, and I'll show all that to you. And basically that led to the zenith of the civilization, Islamic civilization. In Baghdad, in Samarkand, in Bukhara, all these places, basically they took that architecture of learning from this part of the world and combined it with learning from this part of the world and Greece and their own investigations, and that was basically the rise of the Islamic civilization. Now, what Makdisi also had shown, he had shown the other missing link, how the Arab learning, the Arab madrasa from Jerusalem was copied by Paris. So you have this link which I completed just about a month ago, that I was documenting all these developments here, but I couldn't find the link to Europe, and the work of Beckwith and Makdisi basically found the two missing links from India to the Middle East and then Middle East to Europe directly. And it's not just that it was influenced, it is that they took the entire physical architecture and the software, the hardware and the software in toto, almost exactly as it is there. All right. First of all, very quickly, and this is not the main focus of my talk, but I'll quickly talk about it. This is where Takshala is. It's in Pakistan. It's a suburb of Islamabad. I've been there. That's where the great roads, the Uttarapath, or what is called the Grand Trunk Road, basically meets up there, goes through all the major cities of North India. And this is the Silk Road, the Zeidenstrasse that connects to China. And this is the Royal Road to Iran that goes all the way up to the Greek coast. So all of those met in Takshala. That's why Takshala was the great ancient center of learning. Alexander the Great and many others basically came there. And then, of course, when it was destroyed by the White Huns, then Nalanda and Vikramshil are developed here. But then later, a couple of hundred years later, Jagaddal and Sompura, these are very much in Bangladesh. They are also, Odantapuri, we don't know exactly where it is, and Vallabhi in Western India. So these were the 7 universities, and I will not go into the details. By the way, this indicates that this part of the world was the richest. This is the GDP share from Angus Madison for 1600 years, right? India was actually higher than China right up until 1500. And that's why the whole world came here, right? Anyway, and this is Sompura. This is why I'm going to Rajshahi, I'm going to Sompura tomorrow. If you look about it, it never struck me. A month ago, I didn't know. I mean, if you've been to any great university in the West, in Europe or North America, this is exactly the plan, right? You have a quadrangle with faculty offices. You have a porch, a walking porch. All these are, this is a covered porch in front. And it's a quadrangle. This is borrowed from Ajina Tepe to the Middle East. And by the way, Sompura is the most beautiful expression of Ajina Tepe. Ajina Tepe was 8th century. This is from the 11th century. And this is the exact hardware of the university. And of course, there's a software. There's a method of argument. Remember, the Greeks had dialogues. That is not the way to conduct a scientific experiment. So that they borrowed from India. You know, the exact structure of a scientific argument or a logical argument, I won't go into those. That is what Beckwith basically says. And by the way, I'm quoting here from Sanskrit, Jagatam Netrek Vishram Bhuhu, singular feast to the eyes of the world. This is from an inscription from around 1140, found in Nalanda, describing Sompura, right? So this is an inscription found several hundred miles later. I won't go into this. This is, of course, what it looks like right now that I'm hoping to see tomorrow. This is an artist's, I had one of our artists recreate that. This is what it would have looked like in its heyday. I won't go into it, but literally these were the 18 major innovations that happened. This is the sum total in one slide of what I have found so far, right? And these are the 7: foundation, demise. First of all, a university has to have all subjects. It must be residential because transformation requires 24/7, right? A great university can be a day school, but the real experience comes from residential because then the true transformation happens. Global, secular, meaning it should be available to everybody regardless of religion. There should be peer review, there should be science, financial assistance, degrees, a library, academic freedom, admission standards, public funding, endowments, competing centers, autonomy, corporate form. There must be some corporate elements also. As I said, you cannot be totally corporate, but some corporate forms. There should be even a centralized function, and women's education. So all of these basically occur, and I won't go into this. We can spend days on this, but let me just leave it at that. So some of the learnings there are that there has to be public funding because of the externality and public goods problem, public-private partnership, including private funding. By the way, many of these institutions that I talked about were also funded by the public, not just by the state. There were individuals who made endowments, and we have in some cases hundreds of donors and their names which are available to us that they supported it. Culture of free inquiry, support by the state, academic excellence, and competing centers. All right, now to the modern times in governance and alumni governance, okay? So if you look at the Shanghai Jiaotong list of the top 30 universities, with the exception of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 23 of the top 30 universities according to the Shanghai Jiaotong list are American. As Henry Rosofsky points out, no country has ever dominated any industry ever the way America dominates higher education now. What is the traditional answer? Let me just skip this. Traditional answers, this is from Henry Rosofsky's book. He was the provost at Harvard. He wrote this book called The University and Owner's Manual. He says it has to do with why are American universities so good. His answer was, it has to do with wealth, population, research support, the fact that it's an open economy with private philanthropy, fierce competitiveness, tenure, and unitary governance. So this is something that was his answer. Now the problem is that Europe has tried to recreate every one of these, but hasn't really moved the needle very much. So what I did is that the boards, as I said, of the top 100 US universities, and what I found, actually, let me skip a couple of slides, and actually let me share this with you. Yeah, take a look at this. If you look at the top private universities, Princeton, Harvard, this is from the 2020 list, US News and World Report. 100% percentage of alumni on the board, 100% for Princeton, Harvard, Columbia, Yale. MIT is 75, Stanford is 93, Chicago is 88, 92, 72. The only slightly lower one, which is still pretty high, 51%, is California Institute of Technology, because they have a very large board. I think they have 50, 60 members, which is not quite optimal. And so on down the line. Pretty much you can see that. And it's not just the top 100. Just go, very rarely do you find anyone where the alumni are not in a majority. And it's not just private universities. I was at a great public university. I taught there for many years, first in the economics department, then in strategy, Purdue, which is a state university. And 9 out of 10 trustees there are alumni, even though they are nominated by the governor, right? So this is now, why does alumni governance work so well? Let me share, so this is the crux, this is the main slide that I want to share with you today, and let me take 5 minutes to discuss this, and then maybe we can open it up for Q&A. Okay? There are basically 5 models of university governance that I've been able to identify. The first one doesn't work, period. A for-profit private university is the worst kind of university that you can imagine. There are a few. India forbids them. You cannot, under the law, cannot have a for-profit private university. For-profit university, period. You cannot have it. Most countries forbid it, but there are a couple of which do not. America does not. Philippines does not. And you've never heard of the private for-profit universities. They're really glorified training institutions which train nurses, assistants, and undertakers and those kinds of things. They're really training institutions where you come in, you get your training, and you get a job. Kind of a low-tier job is basically what it is. And for the reasons that I mentioned, that you cannot create a university because of those externalities and market failures and so on, right? Now, so what are the alternatives? The state is a very popular alternative. A lot of the universities in India, for example, are state-run by either the central government. There are 55 of them, and every state has 1 or 2 or more state universities that they run. For example, Calcutta University or Presidency University, these are now state-run, or Jadavpur, these are all state-run universities of the state of West Bengal. And Delhi University and JNU are central universities in Delhi. Now, what is the problem with the state? Well, the commonality of interests is not fully aligned, right? If you think about it, the state has very different objectives. Some are aligned. They want higher education, but they don't necessarily want quality. They will want quantity much more than quality. And that's fine, but beyond a certain point, it creates a challenge. Also, the biggest challenge is access to information. I happen to sit on the boards of some public institutions, and it's just bizarre how long it takes for the government to react, because this is not, even for the education ministry, which controls many of these institutions, this is not the highest priority item. That the head of an institution is retiring, literally on the last day they will say, okay, extend the term by 3 months. And then literally on the, after the person has retired, then you constitute a search committee that will take another 6 months. And then, you install the next one, and then the cycle continues. So it is not, quick, timely decision making is not on the agenda of civil servants when it comes to public universities if they sit on the board. So you can see that market doesn't work. State is a very poor governance mechanism. Trusts, a little bit better. So if, for example, you have a religious trust, they can sometimes, and if they are very passionate about education, you can perhaps do a little bit better job. But many of the same incentive and control issues, especially after a couple of generations, reassert themselves in the same way. They become like the quasi-state, right? There is no particular love between that trust and the institution. The worst is faculty governance. Never put faculty on the boards of universities so that they control it. And I'll tell you why. It's like insider trading. And the best example of that is what happened to Columbia. Until 1880, Columbia was the richest university in the United States, richer than Harvard. Why? Because the British Crown left it with these very valuable rent-paying New York properties. So they were swimming in money. What did they do with that money? Because it was 100% faculty governed, they ate it all up. Because nobody was there to check them, right? All the money was coming in, they were in charge, they set their own salaries. In other words, never put people on the board who can set their own salaries. So you have to basically, you can have 1 or 2 faculty members, that's okay for information purposes, but they cannot be the driving force. And I showed in my paper that in 1880, a typical Harvard professor was paid $2,500, which in today's money is about $120,000. A typical Columbia professor was paid $7,500, which was $375,000 in today's money. That's how they ate it up. So that doesn't work. Now, alumni. Why does putting alumni on the board work? Nobody knows the institution more than the alumni. and nobody cares about the institution more than the alumni. Why? If you are a graduate, say, of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, or ULAB for that matter, if ULAB is the number one university in Bangladesh, whose human capital is most affected? Your human capital, right? When you get up and say, I'm a graduate of ULAB, and ULAB is number one, it's an immediate signal that you're good, that you're well qualified, that you're a person of substance. On the other hand, if it falls in the rankings, you'll be affected the most. So therefore, turning it to the alumni turns it over to the people who have the biggest interest in maintaining quality in that institution. Do you see that? And more importantly, this is a great way to then shift competition from the market for profit to prestige. So what then happens is that Harvard and Yale alumni compete to say, my university is better than yours. Or Purdue and Northwestern compete, or Stanford and Berkeley will compete. And in fact, they all compete with each other. And if any university starts to fall in the rankings, it's the alumni who basically start a campaign and say, we have to raise more money, we have to basically build up the quality of our schools. So therefore, because of the alumni involvement, the quality of renewal in US universities is basically of the highest caliber. They're constantly renewing themselves. And more importantly, they have accountability, right? So I remember when I was at the School of Management at Krannert at Purdue, the Board of Trustees had a subcommittee of alumni who were overseeing the management school. So the dean had to make a presentation every year to this subcommittee, and if there was any problem, then they would step in and help. And conversely, if the dean was not performing well, then they could step in and basically fire the dean. So that immediate whereas in a state system or other systems, that accountability is just not there. And most importantly, they are the ones who raise the resources for the university. And the final thing that I should mention is which university pioneered this. It was actually a Sarkari university, a government university that was being strangulated by the state. I won't go into that story unless you have a specific query about it. It was none other than Harvard. Harvard was the first university in the world that pioneered alumni governance. On the 29th of April, 1865, for reasons I won't go into here, which I'm happy to mention them, it was turned over by the state of Massachusetts. And remember, if you go and see this constitution on the web, I've taken a facsimile of it. It talks about the State University of Massachusetts, and that's Harvard. It was being strangulated by the state and would have collapsed and disappeared until, for reasons that I'm happy to share with you later, it was turned over to the alumni, and within 20 years it became a world-class institution. Within 10 years its endowment tripled. In the next 10 years, it tripled again. In about 20 years, its endowment became 10 times, and they never looked back. Okay? So basically, what I'm suggesting is that this is one of the 24 major innovations that I talked about, right? That I will talk about in my book. 18 of which happened in this part of the world. Europe takes those 18, adds or recreates those. I don't know fully yet which one was copied and which one was not. Some were certainly copied. Adds 3 more. America borrows those 21, adds 3 more, of which the most interesting one is alumni governance. And that's the formula for creating a great world-class university, starting with governance. Okay? But then you have to also fix the other things. So with that, how are we doing for time?
We have about 15 minutes.
For Q&A?
15 to 20, yeah.
Okay. So, so let me just close here. And I said I must include something which is here. So I thought I'd include this. Obviously, I can't really read. This is from Tagore's Chitta Yatha Bhaya Shunya, right? You've all seen this poem. Unfortunately, when it is Chitta Yatha Bhaya Shunya, yes. Sorry, my pronunciation is a Hindi pronunciation, not Bengali, not Bangla. So, Nij haste nirdaya aghat kari pitaha bharater sei swarg karo jagaritaha. By the way, this is the closing stanza from his poem, but it's not there in the English translation. In Gitanjali, for which he got the Nobel Prize, as you know, it is not there. So why am I bringing this up? I bring this up quite often, that we have to, without pity, get rid of the elements in our systems that do not work. And then, without any worry about where great innovations have occurred, many of which, as I said, occurred here in this part of the world, we should adopt good things and mercilessly give up things that do not work. I think that is how our ancestors became great, or were great, and that is how I think we can also aspire to the same level of greatness and the same level of, how shall we put it, being in charge of creating the frontiers of the world, right? Right now we are catching up on many dimensions when it comes to the frontiers, but if we are to build our own capabilities and build our own knowledge systems, then these are the things that we have to focus on, namely institution building, on culture, on values, on all the little details that that are required in building a great institution. So with that, I thought that this, so this is what I was, I thought I'd put that in. I was thinking on my way to the airport, what aspect of Bangla should I bring in? So then, as I was sitting in your office, in your wonderful boardroom, I pulled this up from my records and I just included this for you. So let me pause here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.